Kermit was one of 4 or 5 people who came out of a conscientious objectors camp. And they had been doing various kinds of artwork at the camp. And one of the things they did was to develop a theater. They started out in the, well, I guess it would have been the mid-40s. And then after the war, they came out and wandered around. Some of them went down to Los Angeles, and some of them came to San Francisco. Some stayed up in Oregon, where the camp was. And they worked on trying to get the group together. Kermit wrote a lot of letters back and forth to people that had gone back to the East Coast or down south to try to get the group together to decide on establishing a geographical place for a theater. And Kermit's favorite, I think, was San Francisco. He went down and did some teaching he went back to teaching after the war down in Los Angeles, but he didn't stay at that very long. He managed to get up to San Francisco and then got a number of people to come from the East Coast and from Oregon and down to San Francisco. They started out by working with rehearsing in people's living rooms. They would work for sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes months, before they could find a place to rehearse. And some of the places that they rehearsed were odd places, like the Quakers meeting hall. One of their first productions that they did, when they finally did find a place to rehearse and to produce a play, was down on Beach and Hyde Street. And the night that they were supposed to open the play, the fire department arrived and closed them down because they didn't have a permit. So they gathered together all the people in the audience and ferried them down to the Dolphin Rowing Club, which was a block down the road, where they got permission there. They produced plays at the San Francisco Museum of Art. The interplayers, it was a group of idealistic people. That's apparent. The fact that they came from a conscientious objectors camp, yes. I think their original mission, as they stated it, was to produce plays of social importance. It was not specifically anti-war. In 1950, I arrived in San Francisco in 1948, and I fooled around in a little theater elsewhere, and then I discovered, just by accident, this little theater. They had not been performing, but they were rehearsing. They were rehearsing The Castle and The Family Reunion. And I went down with a friend of mine who was, it was a rainy day. We were downtown. We had one umbrella between the two of us, and I either had to go home and get wet or go down to the theater with her, because she was going to go down and rehearse and try to get a part in the play. So I went with her. And I got a part in that play. I got cast that night. That was 1950. They were mainly plays of social significance. We did a lot of Shaw, T.S. Eliot. We did some Shakespeare, not very much. The first play that I was in was Kafka's The Castle, which certainly is of social significance. One of Kermit's friends was a playwright, a poet. We didn't know him at that time as a playwright. His name was James Broughton, and he'd written a play that was that had been made from various of his earlier poetry, and Kermit wanted to produce this, and so we did it. The Playground was something that I think was written during a time when James, it was the time of the atom bomb, and a time when all of society thought at any moment, this may be our last moment. As James matured, or as time passed, I think his attitude towards life gradually became a lot more cheerful and a lot more forward-looking, so that he became, I think, I think his vision of life changed a lot, and he became a very positive thinking person. After reading a speech from the Playground, you might think the world is about to collapse. But I think a lot of his later poetry, he had a kind of a mantra. Eventually, I think he developed that over a period of years, that things happen, and it's up to you to make good things out of the bad things that happen. And I remember this phrase, which Kermit repeated to me, which is adventure, not predicament. When something bad happens, you look at it and you see all the strings attached, and you kind of tie them together, and you have something that is quite wonderful and fun. So life is fun. Our plays in general, we had very good reception from our audiences, and I think what happened was that we developed an audience for ourselves over the years. We didn't have many people at first. There were times when, as the old saying goes, the actors outnumbered the audience. But things just, gradually grew, and every once in a while we would have a really, a zinger of a performance, and then our performances would be extended. And one of those was Kermit's San Francisco's Burning. He didn't write the play, but he directed it in such a way that it added so much life and imagination to the script that I think our run was extended from an original 8 weeks to eventually 6 months. There were a couple of others also that he directed. Caligula by Camus. That one, again, I'm not sure how long a run that was supposed to have originally, but it also ran for 6 months. But in our earlier times, most of the time we had 8-week runs. Our group never paid anyone at the beginning. In fact, the actors were the ones who invested money. I think there were 6 people who invested $150 each to get started. After quite a few months, maybe a couple of years, all of those loans had been repaid out of the box office, but it did take quite a while. Did anybody get paid? No, nobody got paid. None of the actors got paid. We decided as a group that when we would have some money coming in, that the first person that we would pay would be the janitor. And Kermit actually was our first paid person, not an actor. He was our first paid member. He was the one who cleaned up the theater before and after performances, washed the bathroom, and saw to it that the coffee cups were washed afterwards, and so on. While we were the interplayers, we never had any paid actors. Once in a while, we managed to get enough money together to pay a little bit to a visiting company. If we had a dry period and we hadn't had very much coming in, Sometimes we would borrow some artists that were better known than we and then pay them a pittance, and then we would have the box office, which would help us to keep going for another few weeks or months. I was in 2 of James Broughton's plays and a couple of his films. He was wonderful to work with because he didn't have any criticisms ever. Everything was wonderful. I'm not the only one in our group that has said that all I wanted was to change the world, to save the world. And I think that, somehow that came out of the Conchi camp. Although I think most of us who joined the theater after the war was over did not realize that it had started in a conscientious objectors camp. I didn't know for years that Kermit had been in a camp. And, years, really, literally, maybe 30 years after I knew him, that he ever talked about it. And yet there was that kind of spirit about all of the people that group attracted. We found each other. We somehow unconsciously weeded out those parts of us that didn't work towards the same idealism as others, and I don't think we were even conscious of it. This is the thing. When you're living something, you're not watching yourself living. So it isn't until 50 years later you sit and look back and you say, what was I doing? Well, what would anybody have been doing that was doing what I was doing, or what we were doing? Well, they would have been trying to change to save the world. Manch Harvey, who was one of our staunchest people, is somebody whose very statement I ran across recently. I saw her quoted somewhere as saying, "I didn't ever have any idea of anything for myself. I just wanted to save the world." Nothing that she could state other than that. And yes, I think we did. That's the way we chose our plays. We chose our plays by having meetings very regularly about what our aims were, and we talked a lot among ourselves, either in a large group or a small group, about exactly what we were trying to do with each play that we chose. That it had to have certain characteristics. It had to have something more than just entertainment. Oh, we like to laugh too, and we loved doing comedies. And a lot of times, comedies can be, very educational. I think James' plays were chosen simply because he was friend of Kermit, and Kermit was the leader of the theater, and because he and James were so close, it just seemed quite natural that Kermit would be producing James's plays, and it seemed quite natural to us too. We were delighted to have what some people have called a resident playwright. I didn't ever know him to have lived at the theater. I'm not sure that he was a resident, but I know he was a member, and he was certainly apparent around there. And whenever when he made his films, Kermit supplied his actors. That's all we knew about it, was Kermit would say, "I have this friend who wants to make a film. Will you be in it?" And so nobody ever said no. And so we would put ourselves in the most amazing positions, We were taken to very odd places. We were out at the windmills out in Golden Gate Park, way out there on cold, windy, foggy days, and told to, we never asked, what are you doing with this? We never asked, "Oh, this is great fun. James is great fun. Let's go, let's make a movie." And so he would put us somewhere, and he would say, "Now, you stand there and you walk over there and, all right, now just a minute. All right. And then he would confer with Kermit. He'd say, what? Okay, now you down there. Okay, now that way. Walk over there. Now, give me a big smile. Who knows how he put these things together? We were just pieces of a big puzzle. And, it was great. We coalesced, and it just brought us all together, all the people that were working on a film. Looney Tom, okay. I was dressed up in the costume that I had worn for the castle, or no, it was from a costume I'd worn in James's other play, How Pleasant It Is to Have Money, which was of a huge dowager with a great big hat and furs and so on. The thing that he was filming was Looney Tom the Happy Lover. Kermit was the main character, Looney Tom, and Looney Tom just loved women. And every time he'd see a woman, his eyes would light up and he would go chasing after them. And I played the character of supposedly the matron of this bunch of young, pretty girls around whom Looney Tom was chasing. And James had me walk along a hedge, behind a hedge, and he filmed it in such a way that all you saw of me was the hat bobbing up and down behind the hedge. And then I came around the hedge and Looney Tom saw me, and I gave him some kind of a look, and he kind of scooted away, and then afterwards he snuck around and came up and started flirting with me too, and I tried to get him to go away, and eventually I don't remember it very well, but I think he took me, and as soon as he touched me, I sort of melted, and the next thing you know, we were both on the floor. That was Looney Tom. That was my big part in Looney Tom the Happy Lover. I was the dowager, I got the guy in the end. Yeah. The other film of his that I was in was The Adventures of Jimmy. And there were several scenes of Jimmy walking down San Francisco streets in areas that were not very nice for a young man who's quite inexperienced in the ways of women. And there were a couple of us who were dressed up as prostitutes, and we just stood at the corner and tried to lure poor Jimmy in. To me, San Francisco in the late 40s was heaven. I had come from Minnesota, an area that was very stilted, very, very unadvanced. There was not much going on in the way of culture that I knew about. When I got out to San Francisco, I felt a kind of freedom that I hadn't felt before, even though in those days, even San Francisco was not really free as far as gay people are concerned. Finding the interplayers, feeling relaxed in an area where most of the actors and most of the people that worked in the theater were gay. Most of them, at least, were gay-friendly. Not all of them, but more than normal, more than average. Also, San Francisco was full of young poets, actors, painters, North Beach area was very lively, and we always, I mean, Saturday night was North Beach. If you weren't performing in a play, well, it felt very much live. I think that the aftermath of the war, the relief of having the war off our shoulders, in spite of the fact that the atom bomb was up there somewhere. Still, I think, for me anyway, there was a feeling of relief at being in San Francisco. And I loved the city from the moment I saw it. I had hitchhiked from Minnesota, and then I'd gotten as far as Los Angeles and stayed there for about 10 minutes and hocked my watch and got on a bus and rode all night to San Francisco. And when, it was like 7 o'clock in the morning and the sun was just rising and the bus came over the hill and I looked out and there was San Francisco. And it was like a fairy tale kingdom somehow. I fell in love with it just by looking at it. And so I was very well disposed to San Francisco. And then I did have a very few friends here, so that helped a great deal. And I just got into the scene right away. I really had a good time. It was heaven. Yeah. I guess everybody just kind of took James and Kermit as being a pair, as a matter of course. Didn't see as much of James as we did of Kermit, of course, because Kermit lived at the theater and he directed half the plays that we put on. I think I assumed they were together, but in those days we did not discuss that. It was not something. It was a very private thing. It was felt rather than discussed. Really, it's difficult for me to express anything about this. The focus was on theater, frankly, and not on sex, not on being gay, and there were people who, now that I think of it, I suppose may not have been comfortable with us, and yet I think I may be wrong about that because they wouldn't have been around if they weren't comfortable with us, and we wouldn't have been around if we weren't comfortable with them. Really what drew us together was our work and not our social lives. Just about impossible. To be outside of our little group, no, you would never. You do anything in the world to not let anybody suspect that you were gay. I mean, it's just those were the days of the FBI following you around. It was the days where if you had a job, you were in constant terror of losing it. All they needed was the shadow of suspicion that you might be gay and you could be terminated. Who would be open at a time like that? No, when did I start ever wearing pants around anywhere? Not until probably the 60s. Women wore dresses, that's all. And had long hair. I'm sure that Joyce Lancaster and Adrian Wilson, I know that they knew that James and Kermit were a couple, and although they probably disapproved of it, I don't know whether they ever said anything. I always felt very uncomfortable around Joyce because I suspected that she knew about me or knew that she suspected me or something, so I never spent much time around Joyce because I always felt a little uncomfortable with her. No, I would never be comfortable in letting anyone know that that I was gay, unless I knew they were. No.
It was a different time.
It was a different time. Oh, yeah. Now, I don't know that James had that feeling. I know Kermit did. Kermit was not at all swishy, and he tried to be as masculine as he could. James, I don't know. I know that because of the fact that he spent like years and years in psychoanalysis trying to go straight, that yes, he was disapproved of being gay. You know, it's terrible to disapprove of yourself. But he got married, and later on, Kermit got married, and I was married twice. One of my husbands is here today. So.
And yet you were a lesbian all that time.
Pardon?
You were a lesbian all that time.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, yeah, excepting when I wasn't. I mean, when I was gay in myself, but I did not act it out, excepting with, when in the privacy of my own home. Yeah. Probably most people assumed that James and Kermit were a couple, but I don't recall anyone ever having talked about it. So I don't think people, maybe they didn't think about it very much. It was a time when people did not talk about things like that. Yeah. It's kind of weird. The forming of the group, I think of that whole experience as being organic. It grew by itself it really grew by itself. There was no formal dream of having this happen, to take 10 years. In 10 years, we're going to have such and such happen. No, this is for today, now. We are doing this now. I love it. I love being back together with, some of them are people that I directed at the theater, and some of them are people that I acted with at the theater. Some of them are people that I never worked with at the theater, which also is interesting, because I was gone from the theater for 2 years in Europe in the early 50s, and then again in the early 60s. I was down in Central America. So there were things going on, great things that I missed because I was out of the country. I feel like it's sort of like coming home, coming back to a family. There's a kind of intimacy that you develop in those years, that meeting people for the first time in these years, one does not necessarily develop that kind of intimacy. But at that age, in one's 20s and early 30s, you get together with people and you get close faster. And so it's almost like suddenly being able to meet people and become close suddenly again. I like it. I like getting together with the same kind of people that I worked with in those days. I've worked in a lot of different places since then, but I don't bother to get together with those people. But I would be happy to see any of the people that I ever were. Well, let's say there's 2 or 3 that I would rather not get together with, but most of them are people that I really enjoyed being with, and I still enjoy being with. This was James Broughton's The Playground. It was actually the first or second play that I was in at the Interplayers back in 1950. At the time that I joined the Interplayers, we were not yet able to perform in our building. We would rehearse. a play, and then we would set that aside for a few weeks, and we would rehearse another play, and then we would come back and rehearse. We did rehearsal and repertory for a good 6 or 8 months before we managed to get permission to put on our plays for an audience. I think the playground is about the times that we were living in the 50s. It was a perilous time. It was a free time. It was a wonderful time. The war was over, and we were setting out in new directions. But at the same time, we were under a lot of stress because of world condition. You know, now we have atom bombs. We have atom bomb scares, but it's nothing like it was at that time. We were, no matter how ebullient and gay and energetic we could be, there was always an underlying knowledge that at any moment it could end. That's James's playground is about. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think we changed the world. I think we are still changing the world, and I think that people that are coming up now are certainly changing the world. And I think actually it's more obvious to me now what people are doing to change the world than it ever was while what was happening in my youth. I'm amazed that we are actually getting stuff done in terms of clearing the air and the water and so on. I know it's really slow, but still, I think it's taking it's a far quicker road than I ever experienced in my youth. When James entered a room, all eyes turned to him. It was very strange. He need not say anything. All he had to do was enter the room. There was some kind of magic about him, a kind of a light that emanated from him. I guess I felt it, and I guess other people must have too, because it would, you know. People would say, "Oh, here's James. James. There's James." Yeah, he was there.